Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're listening. Welcome back to AI and the Future of Work. This is your host, Dan Turchin, advisor at Insight Finder, the system of intelligence for IT operations, and CEO of PeopleRain, the AI platform for IT and HR employee service. As you know, each week we share conversations with entrepreneurs, thought leaders, investors, and journalists who are defining how we'll live and work for, say, at least the next 30 years. We discussed the emerging field of AI ethics a few weeks back, and we touched on the implications of AI and automation. The World Economic Forum says AI will lead to the elimination of 85 million jobs by 2025. But by the way, it's also going to lead to the creation of 97 million jobs. What that research doesn't contemplate is how we'll train 97 million employees to succeed in those new jobs, and equally important, how we're going to reskill those 85 million employees whose jobs will be displaced. Now, today's guest is an expert on just that topic. Bryan Talebi started Ahura AI in 2018 to make reskilling and upskilling easier for employees. We're in the midst of a transformation of the traditional labor force like we really haven't seen in the past, say, 250 years since the first industrial revolution, and technology is catalyzing the shift, but it's also going to prepare us for what's ahead. Thankfully, entrepreneurs like Bryan identified this problem years back, and they're helping the next, say, billion employees stay relevant. We're going to focus on AI ethics and the new labor force in a series of upcoming episodes. This may be the most important conversation of our generation. Without further ado, Bryan, my pleasure to welcome you to the podcast. Let's start off by just having you share a little bit about your background and how you stumbled into this space.
Absolutely, Dan. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on the show. And of course, thank you in the past for bringing me up on stage for your other events. I always enjoy our conversation. So a little bit about my background. I was born in a tiny village with no running water and no electricity out in the southeastern desert of Iran. And I was extremely fortunate because the government wanted to execute my family. So we escaped to Turkey, lived in a refugee camp for a couple of years before coming to the United States. And the reason I said I was so lucky is because suddenly I had access to the American education system and access to opportunity. And so I began working at NASA when I was 16, started my first company in college, had a couple exits, then got into the tech space, worked as a manager, and then later as an executive at a series of tech companies where I led growth. Had a couple of unicorns, a couple of exits. And in 2018, I decided to start Ahura. And the reason I founded Ahura is because as an executive at a series of artificial intelligence companies, I recognized that we were using this powerful new technology that was transformational in so many industries to make gobs and gobs of money in advertising, in retail, in social media, in regular media consumption. And yet we had this entire vertical of education that has not been disrupted in 150 years. And so to me, that's mind-blowing because it's such an important sector. And yet, if you go into any traditional business, if you go into a hospital and they hadn't changed for 150 years, you'd walk right out. If you go to a restaurant or a shop and they hadn't changed for 150 years, you'd walk out. And so I didn't understand why it's okay that with the educational system, something that underlies all of the change and growth in our society, we have this phobia of education and phobia of transformation. And so I realized this is back in the day when ed tech was not considered cool at all. I had quite a few people tell me that I'm wasting my time and wasting my life by trying to build an ed tech platform. But at the end of the day, I decided it was really important because I recognized the impact that education had on my life. And I recognized the power of education in raising people out of poverty and enabling developing countries to be able to catapult forward.
And before we press record here, you and I were talking about some of the travails of being an entrepreneur. Talk us through your journey. What have been some of the highs, and maybe more important for our listeners, what have been some of the lows?
Sure, and we've had a lot of both, that's for sure. I know recently we've been very fortunate. We've been catapulting forward. I'll get into that later. When I founded the company, I went from getting paid a very large chunk of money as an executive at leading growth at companies, living in a penthouse in Manhattan, to moving in a very reasonable apartment with a bunch of roommates out in Brooklyn, and kind of reduced my lifestyle, and for a good reason, because I was taking investor money. I was able to raise my pre-seed round really, really quickly, and I was able to attract some really great players. Now, then we hit some challenges, of course, as companies often do. There's a lot of ups and downs. And I learned a lot about myself. I learned a lot about leadership. I learned a lot about bringing the right people on the team. And we realized that selling to the university space is really challenging. Very long sales cycles, few budgets, very small budgets rather, and a lot of tech phobia. And I sat down with over 50 presidents of universities, and most of them told me, Bryan, why would we change what we're doing? We're raising tuition every year. We're making money hand over fist. We're doing great. Now, this is pre-COVID, and of course, during COVID, all of those same presidents reached out to me begging me to let them use Ahura to solve some of the problems they were having. But at the time, we realized that wasn't the right place to go. And so we had to have a couple pivots. And while we were having those pivots, we actually ran out of money 3 times. Now, the first 2 times we ran out of money, I just liquidated a bunch of assets and filled the coffers up personally, made sure I kept everyone on payroll. I was obviously not paying myself anything other than minimum wage as legally required, but I wanted to make sure that the team was fed and taken care of. The 3rd time we ran out of money, I thought to myself, you know what, I'm just gonna tighten the belt, and instead of continuing to liquidate my personal assets, I'm just gonna figure out how to make this happen. Of course, I lost some more of the members of my team doing that. There was a point in time when I had just moved to Silicon Valley from New York, where I was literally living in my friend's closet for free. I had a different friend paying for my cell phone bill. I had a different friend buying me food because the company was completely out of money. I wasn't paying myself. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to figure it out. Of course, I lost all my team members, had to kind of rebuild. Now, of course, we're doing quite a bit better. We just raised a fairly large seed round in the past 3 weeks. We signed a deal, we closed a deal with a handshake. We're working on the contract with Salesforce. And I've been able to attract some global players, including Trisha Chan, who used to write speeches for Steve Jobs and John Scully at Apple and used to lead their PR team. And it was really surprising when she joined because she had been introduced to me by one of my advisors and investors, and she did about 3 months of due diligence on me and came to me and said, Bryan, I want to work for you. And my reaction, I was so surprised by this. And I said, what are you talking about? We can't afford you. You need to go work with like Elon or Jeff Bezos. Like, in what world will you be working with me? And she said, no, Bryan, I love your mission and your vision and the impact you're having on the world. And I believe that you're going to be the next $100 billion company, and I want to be a part of it from the ground floor. And so that just blew me away. And it shows you through the ups and downs in the entrepreneurial journey. It takes a lot of grit to be able to go through the lows. And it also takes a lot of, I think, humility when you're hitting those highs to not believe all the hype and just keep your head down and continue grinding, because that's really what it takes.
You described Ahura as an ed tech platform, and described some of those early tough conversations with the universities. I've seen you on stage, most recently a virtual stage through the Alchemist demo day, and I get inspired by the vision of needing to upskill and reskill and building a platform potentially using AI designed from the ground up for reskilling and upskilling. I cited the World Economic Forum data, 85 million plus employees and potentially a billion, over the next decade. Talk us through, give us the pitch, the founding vision that gets, that gets everyone excited when they hear the magnitude of what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've been talking about this since 2018, back when people told me I'm crazy and it's so far out that we don't need to worry about this. But look, the reality is that we're in the middle of the fourth industrial revolution. This isn't some future state. This is happening right now. So if you think of all of the people who do repetitive manual labor, who are being replaced by artificial intelligence and automation. Of course, the World Economic Forum numbers, as you say, is 85 million by 2025. According to McKinsey, that number is 400 million to 800 million by 2030. If you look at the Boston Dynamics robot that just came out about a month ago, that's going to replace 1 million warehouse workers in the United States alone. Because look, these warehouse robots, they don't need to unionize. They don't need to go to the bathroom. They don't sexually harass their colleagues. They don't call in sick, and they work 24 hours a day. And so when Amazon and Walmart and other retailers do the calculation, it's a no-brainer. Why employ all these people that cause all these challenges when you can just have a robot that doesn't complain? You just program them, and they're off to the races. If you look at truck drivers, that's the most popular job in 34 states. And they're being replaced by self-driving cars right now. There have been self-driving trucks going across the country since 2018, where they've been running all these tests. Anheuser-Busch and Coors were at the head of the race. Now, recently, Amazon and others have been getting in on that. Now, of course, these self-driving trucks don't have accidents. They drive 24 hours a day. They're much less expensive. It's a no-brainer. And yet, how do you take these people, this cohort of individuals, whether they're truck drivers or retail employees or fast food workers or warehouse workers who never went to college, barely made it through high school, and haven't been upskilled in decades? How do you take them and train them for high-tech jobs of the future when you take into account that the existing educational framework failed them the first time around? And I mean that quite literally. It failed them, because when you look at all the research that's been done from the Bloom study onwards in 1982, it showed categorically that when you take individuals and teach them one-on-one by tutors and teachers, they all score in the top 20th percentile when compared with the much larger set of people that are trained in the traditional way in a standard delivery lecture format. So what that tells me is all the people that aren't in the top 20 percentile of scores, it's not that they're failing. You take out the bottom 10%, but that's 70% delta. It's not that they're just failures of life and they can't learn. It's just that our education platform, our education system isn't designed to teach everybody. It's designed for a certain subset of the population. So the question I began asking is, hey, it's not that these people are dumb, they just learn differently. So how do we replicate this one-on-one instruction when in every other industry we figured out this hyper-personalization, right? Whether it's social media or the way you consume content on Netflix or YouTube, or the way you consume products. When famously Amazon knows if you're pregnant before your husband does, right? Or your father does. Every interaction that we have with technology in so many different industries personalized to our unique needs. And yet in education, we still have this one-size-fits-all approach. And so with Ahura, the goal is to use the same level of hyper-personalization that we're accustomed to with every other corporation and every other industry that we engage with, but use it for the way that we learn. And so that's exactly what we built.
So a cynical observer might say that the incumbent to lead this reskilling or upskilling revolution is new online education systems like a Khan or a Coursera. And if you own the content, you'll also own kind of the life cycle of finding the students and measuring them and making recommendations. Where is that logic flawed?
Yeah, for sure. So look, I love Khan Academy. I love Coursera. I think a lot of these organizations were trying to do the right thing by making education scalable and available across the globe. The challenge with all of these MOOCs, as they're called, massive online open courseware, is that they have a one-size-fits-all approach. They do provide access to everyone, but the challenge is they take the same negative trait of the traditional education system and they just put it online. And so there's a reason that over 90% of people that sign up for an education course online quit. That's lower than a 10% retention or graduation number. That's terrible. In the early days, we almost did a partnership with Strayer Capella, and we had a bunch of meetings with their executive team, their C-levels, and we ultimately decided to pull out because they have a 6% graduation rate after charging people tens of thousands of dollars a year. And it's just not working. It's not effective. People are going into debt. And so the challenge that they face is they lack this personalization that's required. And so right now we're just selling to large corporates to solve this upskilling problem because it's a market that we see. Downstream, we are happy to cooperate with all these organizations and enable them to use our technology almost like a Intel Inside, except like Ahura Inside, like powered by Ahura, to leverage the AI that we've built and the personalization engine to enable all these organizations that have the content and have the customer base to be able to deliver a much better product and much better outcomes for their students and their users. And so we're happy to collaborate there. We don't look at competition as a zero-sum game because the market is just so massive, and ultimately the goal is to help society.
So you teased about there being wet ink on a Salesforce agreement. Tell us the story. When that deal closes or ones like it, what's the user experience? How are you changing some of the problems, like with the completion rate at a Strayer Capella? What's Ahura going to do for those users?
Yeah, thank you very much for that. So we're also, in addition to Salesforce, we're in negotiations right now with 2 Fortune 10 companies as well, which is quite exciting. But so what happens with a lot of these corporations, and I'm going to take a step back to kind of give some context, and then I'll answer your question. A lot of these large corporations have a decision. They're laying off tens of thousands of employees, some of them hundreds of thousands. And so they can either A, spend the money, all the severance packages, all the unemployment benefits, lay off this massive group of people, but then they still have to hire new employees for new business units that they have that fulfill high-tech sector positions. And they, of course, have to pay recruiters to do that. They have to bring people in. They have to onboard them. Oftentimes, people don't work out because of a lack of culture fit, or they don't show up on time and so forth. That's quite expensive. Now, there's tons of studies, and so a lot of folks, a lot of these companies have decided it costs 1/6 as much to take their existing employees that show up on time, they have good culture fit, they get along with everybody, they're loyal, and to upskill them for existing jobs in other business units. Now, that's already happening. A lot of companies have already made that decision. Amazon just announced $700 million for this. Accenture and Walmart each are doing $1 billion a year for upskilling their existing workforce. So the way that looks is when we talk to these companies, we tell them, look, we can solve this problem for you much more effectively. Your employees are able to learn 3 to 5 times faster, and I'm happy to go through and why that is the case. They're able to learn much more effectively, but also we're able to have a 10x price competitive advantage, because a lot of these corporations, when they upskill all these folks, they have to hire armies of consultants and in-person trainers that sit there with their employees and train them. With our AI, it's much more scalable. We're able to charge 1/10 of the price for a 3 to 5x performance improvement, which is kind of a no-brainer for a lot of these companies. So we come in with a fairly small deal initially, $30 to $50 to $100,000 deals, where we take a portion of their employee base and train them and show them that we're able to generate better outcomes than what they're currently doing. We compare them side by side and then say, hey, now that we've proven that our technology works, let's actually scale it up, because it enables everybody to benefit across the value chain. And so that's what those conversations look like, especially for these larger corporations. And if you're curious about how our tech actually works, just like, have you ever played poker, Dan?
Often.
Yeah, and I imagine many of your listeners have as well. And so when you're playing poker, oftentimes you look for tells from your opponents to be able to determine if they have a good hand or they're bluffing and actually have a terrible hand. So it turns out the computers can do the same thing. If they have enough data points, they can determine quite effectively whether you as a person that's learning is frustrated or inspired, if you're energized or tired, if you're getting distracted or if you're focused. and any number of other mental states. And so we collect 10,000 biometric data points per second per user from the camera, the microphone. If the user has wearables, we collect information from that. And of course, from the websites they visit as well. Now, we do all of this with consent. We have an ethics review board. We have very strict rules about what we will and won't do with that data. We want to stay as far away from the Zuckerberg model of exploitation as we can. And we've made legally binding commitments in that regard from some of the world's biggest stages, the World Economic Forum, the United Nations, US Capitol, and the European Commission in this regard. So we collect all this information, and from this constellation of data, we're able to identify what is the optimal format to use to surface specific educational content to that individual in real time. Now, we compare this data constellation with all of our other users to find lookalikes to then be able to predict for this next piece of content what's going to resonate with them much more effectively. So we transition between text-based, experiential learning, and video formats. Now, even within the video format, it turns out that when you're watching a video of someone explain material, there's a number of variables that impact your ability to pay attention, learn, and retain that information. So everything from their accent, their tempo, their tone of voice, their facial structure, their attractiveness, their gender, their ethnicity, even their sartorial decisions, all have that impact. And so it turns out that maybe at 7 in the morning, when you slept really well, had a great workout in, had a nutritious breakfast, and maybe had your cup of coffee, maybe you need to have a 65-year-old British guy with a posh accent and a tweed jacket explaining the material to you. But maybe at 7 p.m., when you had a really rough day at work, you stopped by McDonald's on the way home, so you're not really putting good stuff in your system, and maybe you just had a fight with your significant other, maybe you need a 25-year-old fashion model explaining the material with you, or anything in between. Maybe you need Beyonce or Taylor Swift or Obama or Nelson Mandela explaining the material to you to get you to pay attention and focus, to learn the information and retain it longer. And so we're able to use deepfakes to alter that content.
So the business model makes sense, and even the technology makes sense. But a central question I have is, take your example of the million skilled factory workers that need to be reskilled or upskilled. How do you determine what the right set of skills is that they need to be relevant when their factory job has been eliminated?
Absolutely. So we leave it to them to decide what job they want to study for. We give them a bunch of options that either come from their existing employer or for other employers that might want to hire them. They look around and say, okay, I want to learn how to be a React Native programmer or a social media manager or a therapist online, or any number of other jobs that are remote and tech-centric. From there, we get curriculums from a variety of education content providers, because as you know, Dan, we've created more content in the past year alone than all of human history combined. There's more educational content than any human could consume in a billion lifetimes. And so we get the entire curriculums from start to finish from a variety of sources, and then determine which of those curriculums we'll use for each sub piece of content that they're learning for that particular 5 to 15-minute lesson that they're consuming.
So is it incumbent on the employer to make sure that the employee using Ahura is being upskilled in a way that will give them kind of an opportunity for lateral progression or lateral promotion within the organization? Ahura is not actually optimizing that part of the process.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we work with large enterprises, we work with them to determine what are all the jobs where there are quite a few openings that they need to fill, and that they want to fill from internal hires rather than external hires. So let's say you have a warehouse worker, but you have all these new positions open for React Native and Java and Python programmers. And so some of these warehouse workers want to become coders and programmers. So let's say one of them decides, hey, I want to be a Java programmer. There's a certain number of Ahuras that they need to earn in order to get that certification and be able to apply for that job. And so throughout the process, they get 3 scores. They get a focus score, a learn score, and a retention score. And then all three of them multiplied against each other give them their total Ahuras that they can earn from 1 to 1,000. Now, each job has a number of Ahuras. Some jobs need 900 or 950 Ahuras to be able to qualify for that job. Some need 800 or 700 or 600 because they're quite a bit easier. And so as they work their way through the curriculum and earn Ahuras, they are motivated to learn the material in an effective way where it's gamified. They see how their peers are doing. They can level set against everybody else. They can text and chat with their friends and their peers while they're learning this material, but they also see how they're scoring. And they get that immediate feedback loop that enables them to understand, are they learning or not, and what they need to change through their behavior in order to increase the number of Ahuras. So for example, the focus criteria is from 0 to 100 points. And of course, when you take 300% or 90% against each other and multiply them, it has a pretty big impact, right? So with the focus, every time they look away from the screen or pull up Facebook in the middle of learning or get distracted by, turning on CNN or Reddit, they lose Ahuras. And because we're watching everything they do, over time, we're training them to actually focus on the work rather than continuously getting distracted. It's like having your mom sitting over your shoulder while you study. Of course, when you're a kid and your mom's sitting right there, you're not going to pull up YouTube and start watching a random video. But oftentimes what we find, especially when we did our alpha version at the Harvard Extension School, these are adults who work during the day, they come home, they have dinner with their families, and then maybe at 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock or 9 o'clock to 10 o'clock, they say, I'm going to study for an hour. But you know what happened when we did this alpha and used this platform on a number of people? We found that the average student, when they studied for 60 minutes, they actually only studied for 7 minutes out of every 60-minute increment. The rest of the time they spent on social media, on news sites, and any number of other websites that they went to online. And of course, at the end of the semester, they get a C or a D and they say, I don't understand, professor. How did I do so poorly? I studied for an hour every single night. Now, the reality is they're not dumb. They're not getting a C or D because they lack the cognitive ability. They're getting the C or D because they lack the ability to focus and haven't been taught how to focus their attention in such a way that they're able to consume that information and remember it and recall it. And so part of what Ahura does, in addition to surfacing the right content for the individual and providing the gamification and the dopamine hits and the positive reinforcement, is it's also designed to train people as an anti-distraction tool to combat all of the work that Facebook and Instagram and YouTube and all these other corporations do to capture your attention and keep it, so that every time you go through dopamine withdrawal, you want to pull up Instagram and see how many likes you have on your most recent post. And so we're able to actually retrain people to be able to focus their attention and learn.
I'm doing the math in my head, 10,000 biometric data points you're collecting every second. And I'm thinking there must be some kind of Ahura gear that's provided to the learner to be able to collect. There must be some sensors involved, AR, VR. What does the kit look like?
Yeah, so down the road, we're definitely planning on implementing AR. But when we built this, we wanted to make sure it's accessible to everybody with the sensors that they currently have. Of course, in a perfect world, I would strap an EEG machine on everyone's head and get perfect data, but that's just not realistic. I can't have people that might not have access to resources like throw down several $1,000s for an EEG kit or specialized gear. And so instead, we designed everything so it works with the sensors that everybody already has, the camera that comes with your laptop or your smartphone, the microphone that comes with either. You're not required to have wearables, but for people that do, it definitely improves the efficacy. So Apple Watch, Fitbit, or a Ring, which isn't that expensive. And then finally, the websites that you visit. So we look at, for example, from the camera, we capture everything from your eye tracking, your facial expressions, your micro expressions, your fidget score, your pupil dilation, your facial flushing. From the microphone, we capture your tone of voice for sentiment analysis and being able to identify your mental state at any given point. We also use speech to text and natural language processing to understand the specific word usage. From the wearables, we capture heart rate, stress rate, activity level, and sleep pattern. And then from the websites, we look at the linguistic distance between what someone's supposed to be studying and what they're actually looking at online.
I got to get us to a stopping point. Unfortunately, time just sped by. But one last question I got to get your take on. So we've been talking about existing employees and their kind of career progression with the platform. But let's take a different scenario. So you're talking to a lot of aspiring entrepreneurs and people who want to be technologists in college right now that are thinking about the right skills to be investing in today. What are the skills that are future-proof?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So there's a number of them. So number one, not that this will necessarily get you ahead, but it will prevent you from falling behind. Definitely learn how to code. And you don't need to be the best coder in the world, but you have to learn how to code and how to communicate with computers. Just like back in the day, if you couldn't read or write, you were considered functionally illiterate. In the next 10 to 20 years, people who don't know how to code and interact with computers effectively will be considered functionally illiterate. So that goes without saying. Number two, I would learn how to communicate effectively, both in voice as well as written communication. That's absolutely critical. I can't begin to tell you how many people come out of college or are entering the workforce that lack basic grammar and communication skills when they're emailing their colleagues or their bosses. The same grammar and rules and social mores that exist for texting and posting on Instagram do not relate to what you need to do in work. So communication is absolutely essential. Being able to work collaboratively with other people, so your EQ is critical. More and more the work that's being done is work that's done collaboratively. You need to be able to regulate your emotions, be able to empathize with other people and so forth. And finally, I would say the most important skill set to learn is something called AQ. So as you know, in the old days, IQ was the most important, so intelligence quotient, then EQ, emotional quotient, and now it's adaptability quotient. Look, nobody can tell you what the future is going to look like. I can constantly talk to some of the biggest futurists around the world, and most of them tell me anybody that tells you they know what the world's going to look like in 20 years is flat out lying to you. And the reason is we are well past that point of inflection in the graph of technological progress, which means every year, technology is changing more than it has before in 10 years. And so it's an accelerating environment where things are shifting so quickly that the people that are going to be the most effective and successful are the people that are most able to adapt to a changing landscape and continuously learn and continuously put themselves in a position to be successful.
Before you're allowed off the hot seat, two last things, Bryan. How can the listeners learn more about Ahura? And equally important, what's the origin of the name?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're welcome to reach out to me. Go to ahuraai.com. There's a place where you can contact us. In addition, you're welcome to email me, Bryan with a Y, Bryan at ahuraai.com. That's AHURAAI.com. You can also DM me on Twitter and Instagram. It's just at Bryan Talebi. Twitter, I think it's Bryan Talebi 3D. The origin of Ahura, the name, it's actually named after the Zoroastrian god of good. So Zoroastrianism is an ancient Persian religion that predated Judaism. It's the first monotheistic religion that pitted a good god, which is Ahura Mazda, versus the evil god, which is Ahriman. And the entirety of the religion, and I'm not Zoroastrian myself, I'm spiritual, but I don't ascribe to a particular faith. But I just think it's really beautiful because the entire faith can be set in good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. And every time a human being does one of these three things, it empowers the God of good. And every time you do the opposite, bad thoughts get bad words and bad deeds, it empowers the evil God. And this good and evil God are in a permanent state of war with each other. And if one of them wins, obviously that changes the universe. And so it's our responsibility as humans to empower the good God, Ahura, Ahura Mazda, but it's named after her, of course, to make the universe a good place. And so I just think that's very simple, it's beautiful, it's elegant, and it's all about wisdom. And so given that I seek to create a world where people live in abundance, they love each other, they treat each other well. And of course, when you're not living in a scarcity mindset, when you're living in an abundance mindset, it's much easier to take care of your fellow man because you're not scraping to get by yourself and to feed your family and so forth. And that's part of the reason that we have an entire universal earned income system built into the Ahura platform. It's the same reason that for every license that we sell to corporates, we give away a free license to members of underserved communities globally, people in refugee camps like I lived, people in sub-Saharan Africa, people in slums in India, and all over the world, because I believe that if we can empower the educational attainment of people around the world, if we can 10x the number of people that have an education, if we unlock the intellectual capability of the human race, I think we can solve all of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I think we can solve every one of the intractable problems that we face as a species.
Just a beautiful explanation. I was prepared for some silly acronym or an anagram of something, but so consistent with your vision and your passion. And we're all going to be hearing a lot more about Ahura. That was really,
I appreciate it. Thank you.
really enjoyable. Well, now I am really going to let you off the hot seat. It's all the time we have, but fantastic discussion. I hope you come back and share with us more about the success of Ahura.
I would love to. Thank you so much for having me.
Bryan, has been great. This is your host, Dan Turchin, signing off, but back next week with another fascinating guest.